fungi are more closely related to animals than to plants. So if you were to construct a phylogeny based on these three groups here, okay, in this case what I mean is an evolutionary tree, if you were to construct a tree based on them, you get something more like this. And on this tree, you can see that all of these eukaryotes share a common ancestor at some point. But the way this tree is structured, you can see that fungi share a closer relationship to animals than they do to plants. And there's kind of this misconception with fungi that, you know, they behave a lot like, or they seem to behave a lot like plants or grow a lot like plants. They grow, you know, in similar environments as many plants. And so for a long time, they used to be considered, you know, and they were actually grouped at one time with plants as close relatives. And I think it's no surprise as to why you might think so. When you look at a mushroom, for example, a mushroom, they appear to be growing straight out of the ground, like so. Okay. Like a plant. Okay. And they even appear to have kind of a root system, almost like plants do. Underground, they have a big network of filaments. Okay. And so it's no surprise as to why they were a long time thought to be either plants themselves or just very close relatives of them. But what you'll see is that, like I said, they share more in common with animals than they do with plants. Okay. So, like I said, it's more appropriate to group them with the animals for various reasons, as you'll see as we kind of move along here. So, we're going to be talking about the importance of fungi in ecosystems. First of all, like I said, they're master traders and recyclers in terrestrial ecosystems. We're going to talk about why we study fungi, how they affect us. And then we're going to look at a little bit on the diversification and the lineages of different fungi. Mainly, we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, how they reproduce. And in addition, we're going to talk about their roles with other organisms. Okay, in this case, the positive and negative relationships that they have with other organisms, types of symbiosis like mutualism, parasitism, the diseases that they can cause. But the biggest one that we're going to be looking at is their role as decomposers, okay, how they break down materials in ecosystems. Okay. So first of all, like this, fungi are eukaryotes. Well, that should be any surprise. I've already categorized them as a eukaryote, right? And like I said, they do share a close relationship with animals, right? Now, one other thing to mention here is that plants and animals are exclusively multicellular. And many fungi are multicellular as well. They have tissues and organs like plants and animals do. However, you'll also see that with an exception, fungi are also, or many of them can be, unicellular as well. So they're the only group that we look at that can be both unicellular and multicellular. And in fact, the unicellular varieties of fungus that we'll look at are actually called yeasts. Okay? So they can be multicellular, yes, and there are many of them that are, but there are some single-cell varieties. Okay? Now, those that do grow as multicellular typically have big branching bodies, like you see here. We actually call this, there's a name for this structure. Like I said, it appears to be very root-like. What you're looking at is the main body of the fungus, called a mycelium. Okay. And when I say main body, okay, the way fungi grow and feed is they actually grow these filaments throughout the environment. They grow this mycelium. That is actually their main body. What you see above ground, this mushroom, for example, right, or even the mold on the surface of bread or fruit, right, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The main body of the fungus is actually growing throughout the food. Okay? So this right here, this mushroom, is just the reproductive organ. It's not even the main body of the fungus. Okay? Like I said, the main body is growing throughout their food. Okay? On that note, they feed a bit differently than other organisms. And I'll talk more about this in just a bit. But as it says here, they absorb their food. And many of them that absorb food secrete enzymes to break it down. And so on that note, what we'll also see about fungi is that they decompose materials, okay, especially leaf litter and wood. They break it down, they absorb the nutrients that are released from that. And I'll talk about how they do this in just a little bit, okay? So they break down their food on the outside and then absorb it, right, using their mycelium. In addition, like I said, many of them absorb material from living organisms. Okay, these are parasites, okay? So they don't wait for an organism to die and decompose it. They'll actually feed directly on a living organism. And so many of these fungi can actually cause disease. That might be a little hard to see here with this light, but I can adjust this. That might help a little bit. What you're looking at are ringworms on the right. And so those are actually a type of fungus that invades living human skin cells and basically feeds on them and breaks them down. And of course that causes irritation. So that's a parasitic type of fungi, okay, one that feeds on a living host. Here you can see fungi that are performing a valuable ecological service. These fungi are actually breaking down wood. Okay, and what you're seeing on the outside of this log are puffballs. These are the reproductive structures. The main body of the fungus is actually growing throughout this log, okay, with that mycelium. So it says many fungi that live in association with other organisms benefit their hosts, and thus are what we call mutualists. Okay? Now, mutualist is an organism that carries out a symbiotic relationship with another organism, and it has to be a mutual type of association. That means both organisms benefit from their association. That's what mutualism is. So it's a type of symbiosis where both organisms benefit. There are many examples of a mutualism in fungi. Okay, so like it says, roots of land plants are colonized by mutualistic fungi. And I'll talk about this here later, but that's what we call mycorrhizal symbiosis. So I'll save that when we get to that point. But it is a relationship where the fungi actually lives inside the roots cells in a plant, and they extend the surface area of the plant's root system and then help them take in more water and minerals. And as you'll see, it's an essential relationship for many plants. Right? So they have this partnership with these little fungi. Other fungi actually live in the upper portions of the plants, up in the shoot system, so above ground. And many of these fungi actually secrete chemicals which prevent insects from feeding on the plant's shoot system, feeding on its leaves, for example. So they secrete chemicals that deter predators. Others may live in the guts of other animals, like insects. Some even live in the guts of things like mammals. That if they eat a lot of wood or plant materials, these fungi that live in their gut actually secrete enzymes that help them break down the cellulose that's found in wood. And I'll talk about how they do this a bit later. But many herbivores, like cattle, would not be able to feed on grass if it wasn't for these little microscopic fungi that live in their gut, help them break down the cellulose in that grass. Okay? So an essential partner in that relationship. And we even see another type of relationship with fungi. Some insects, like leafcutter ants, actually they grow and harvest fungi. And they bring the fungi food, allow it to rot vegetation, and then feed on it. Here's an example of what this looks like. So here's some leafcutter ants. And many of them feed on a wide variety of plants, but a good example would be in Africa, where they actually move through the grasslands, cutting down grass and bringing it back to their nest. And they're not eating the grass, they're actually just taking it back to their nest in a warm, humid chamber in their nest. And then the fungus actually grows and feeds on this rotting grass, essentially. And the ants actually eat the fungus. Okay, so they're actually growing it and harvesting it. Okay, it's kind of like a garden. So that's what you're seeing here, this whitish mold. That's their garden of fungi that they're eating. But among one of their most important roles, as it says here, is as, like it says, master traders and recyclers in terrestrial ecosystems. These are the primary organisms that actually break down plants, okay? And not just plants, a lot of organisms that die. You know, these fungi are kind of the first on the scene to actually start rotting it and breaking it down. And so what they're doing is they're releasing nutrients back into the soil, into the water, into the air, and making it available for other organisms to feed on. But among that, in terms of, you know, the biggest importance with fungi, is their role in what we call the carbon cycle. In this case, their ability to take carbon that was trapped in trees and then re-release it back into the air. And I'll talk about how they do this here in just a moment. Okay, and that's their most important ecological role. Now, I've already mentioned that some act as parasites Okay, like I said, many of them cause disease. And this is in comparison to bacteria, a very, very small number. There aren't that many fungi that actually cause diseases, especially in humans. More, as we'll see, more of our concern with fungi are not the diseases they cause to humans, but to plants, okay, that we depend on for food. Okay. In addition, like I said, fungi nourish plants that nourish us. And I'll talk about, again, the role of this relationship a little bit later. But what I'm referring to are those fungi that live in the root systems of plants. Okay. So like I said, there are about 300 species of parasitic fungi that cause human illness. And this is pretty low in comparison to the diseases caused by other organisms, especially when we look at bacteria and protists, where you're looking at thousands of diseases caused by them. Fungi don't really infect people quite as much as far as other organisms do. Now they can. I mentioned ringworms, for example. I mentioned, I guess another good one to mention would be athlete's foot. That's another type of fungus that feeds on human skin cells and tissues beneath. But they usually aren't as big of a problem, and they usually aren't very lethal. It's only when somebody has a compromised immune system already. So say, for example, that they have, cancer has weakened them, or maybe they have HIV and their immune system is already very compromised, then a fungus could potentially become lethal in that case. But most of the time, they're not the biggest threat to human health. Okay? Usually, we're affected by bacterial or protist diseases more than fungi. It's more about their effect on plants that we're concerned about, because plants are our livelihood. That's our main source of food. And so many of these fungi can either attack and wither living plants, things like diseases like rusts, smuts, mildews, wilts, even blights, wipe out a huge portion of our crops. Like I said, billions of dollars every year are lost because of fungal diseases. So they tend to attack plants more than they attack animals. And here's an example. This is corn smut, and that's basically a type of fungus that grows within the kernels of corns and makes them unpalatable. People throw them away in that case. And so that can be a tremendous loss to our crop industry. Others actually cause rot in fresh fruits and vegetables. So if you have the right conditions where the crops are moist, maybe in a humid environment, it doesn't take long, if they're not properly refrigerated, for a fungus to invade them and then start rotting them. In this case, like you see with these strawberries here, strawberries are one of the hardest hit because they tend to be very low-growing plants, close to moisture on the ground. And so it doesn't take much for a fungus to kind of invade the strawberries and start rotting them. And so this is one reason why many of our crops are heavily applied with pesticides, and that's to wipe out, in this case it's actually fungicide, the type of pesticide, but to kill many of these fungi and prevent spoilage. Which is why they often tell you to wash off your strawberries, and not because of the fungus, but because of the pesticides they apply to them. Okay? Now, of course, we eat many fungi as well. Some fungi we just eat directly, things like portobello and white mushroom, or the button white mushrooms, or shiitakes, things like that. There are mushrooms that we directly eat. But mushrooms actually play a more important role in production of food than they are eaten directly themselves. As it mentions here, yeasts are a single-celled type of fungus. And with these fungi, we actually just use them to ferment, basically break down things like grains, like rice and soybeans and wheats and corn, and all of those as they kind of decompose and ferment. The bacteria, the fungus, actually produces ethanol, which is basically drinkable alcohol. That's a side effect of that process, fermentation. These yeasts, as they ferment, they actually generate carbon dioxide gas. And so one of the things we use them for is to cause bread to rise. And we call that baker's yeast. And so this yeast actually, as it ferments, produces CO2 gas, and the bread or other baked good rises up. In fact, when you cut open bread, you can actually see the little pockets inside the bread, little bubbles where the CO2 would have been. Okay? And baker's yeast and brewer's yeast, in this case bakers for baking and brewers for making alcohol, are essentially the same yeast. They're called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's a very common single-celled, probably one of the most economically important fungi on the planet because of its role in baking and brewing. Others are used to ferment things like soy sauce, for example. Many of them are used to make candies or syrups, and some are even used to make chocolate. As it says here, the cacao seed, which is what we derive cocoa from, is actually fermented and processed using initially a fungus. Okay. Now, as it says here, and I'll mention this one briefly as well, we did talk about antibiotics before. Antibiotics are most commonly produced by fungi, and I talked about what antibiotics are in the previous lecture on prokaryotes. But suffice to say, the first antibiotic ever discovered came from a type of mold, a fungus called penicillium, and I'll show you what it looks like here in a little bit. But it was discovered accidentally in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, and it was known to have, at that time, antimicrobial properties. It secreted chemicals, and it revolutionized the medical industry because of its ability to deter common bacteria. And today we actually get many of our antibiotics from other types of fungi in addition to penicillium. Okay? So help us cure many bacterial diseases. So here is a brewer's yeast and maker's yeast, that's Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Here you can see it fermenting some grain, and you can even see kind of the bubble-ish layer on top. Well, that's the CO2 they're actually producing. There is some ethanol in there as well. It has to be distilled later on to make whatever alcoholic beverage they're making. But it's the same yeast, like I said, that they use in baking, and which you can see here. Okay? So like I said, what causes bread, in this case dough, to rise? Okay, CO2. And many molds are actually used to produce foods that we eat. In fact, like as you can see here, the soy sauce is actually produced by a type of mold called Aspergillus oryzae, okay? Which is interesting because as we'll see a bit later, there are many molds in this family, some of which are actually toxic, but that one's used to produce food. So let's say our bigger concern is how they affect plants. And we've actually had some that have caused blights that have wiped out a tremendous number of plant species. We even have some that are moving through the southeast today that are killing some plants. But in particular, this one I wanted to mention. We used to have, about 100 years ago or so, a little bit over 100 years ago or so, a tree that was all across the eastern United States. It was iconic, and it was the American chestnut tree. Okay, it was a huge tree. You know, at its height, you can actually see here, several hundred feet tall. There's a little logger in between some of these massive trees. But they were all across the eastern United States at that time. They provided chestnuts, which actually fed a wide variety of wildlife at the time. But there are none left. They're all gone, except for a few groves in eastern U.S. And that's because a fungus was introduced from a shipment of wood from Europe in 1904. I don't know if you can see it here, but in New York, and this wood arrived. And every year it spread about 20 to 50 miles, this fungus, moving through these forests of these American chestnut trees. And by 1950, it had reached Florida. And at that point, most of these trees have been completely wiped out. And there's only a few groves of them left today. And conservationists are desperately trying to protect what few remaining trees are left. But for all intents and purposes, it's mostly extinct in the wild. There are very few of them left. But like I said, it would have been widespread across the American eastern United States. Okay. I said wiped out 4 billion American chestnut trees. And so that was just one mold that invaded. Okay. All right. So now, you know, like I said, I've kind of given you an idea of some of the benefits of fungi, at least directly to humans, and some of the threats that they actually cause. But they're not all bad to plants. There are some that actually form mutual associations with plants. Remember I mentioned this before, but I said a mutual relationship is where both benefit. Okay? A mutualism, both species benefit. I like to kind of think of it as a win-win type of relationship that these two organisms have with each other. And in particular, the relationship I wanted to mention was one called mycorrhizal symbiosis. Now, myco is a prefix that means fungus. Rhizal means root. So what you have here is an association between a fungus and the root system of a plant. And it's a mutual type of relationship. What these fungi do is the fungus increases the surface area of the plant's root system. And the idea behind this is what they do is they extend the surface area so the plant can take in more water and minerals. Okay? And this is actually an integral relationship. And we think it's one that evolved very early on with plants. When they first started invading land, and it was very difficult for them to actually pull moisture out of the soil, to retain moisture, many of these early plants, like the rhineophytes, which I mentioned way back 412 million years ago, they first started developing on land. They had already formed this very early relationship with these fungus that live within their root systems. Like I said, it's an integral one. Okay? To be around that long, it kind of makes sense. But if you are, as we'll see, if you actually killed the fungus that lives in the roots of some of these plants, many of them would wither and die very quickly. They just can't produce enough surface area to pull in enough moisture without their little fungal partners. Okay? And many of our forest trees, like pines, like you see here, this little young seedling pine that you see here, okay, a lot of their root system is actually supported by these little fungus. And if you were to actually look at the root system of this tree itself, it's not very big. So here's the base of the tree. Here's the root system. Okay, that's the root system of that little pine right there. The fungus is all of this mycelium that you're seeing here. So look how much of that root system is made up by the fungus. Okay? It's extending the surface area, allowing them to take in more water and minerals. And they've done experiments where they actually applied a fungicide to these plants, and it wasn't long before the little plant would, like I said, wither and die, just not able to take in enough moisture. Okay? Many of our forest trees, like pines, depend on this relationship. You can see an example of the difference between a plant with a little mycorrhizal partner living with us in its roots, and another one where the little partner was killed. You can clearly see a difference in the growth of the plant without the mycorrhizae. Many farmers realize how important they are because many of them actually will seed their fields with these fungal spores to get that relationship started, and that will actually increase their harvest, at the end of the growing season. Now, I mentioned that it's a mutual type of relationship. That means both organisms have to benefit. Now, it's clear why the plant benefits from this because, like I said, it provides water and minerals to the plant, as long as its surface area is increased. What do you think the fungus is getting out of this relationship? If the plant gets water and minerals, what is it able to do? What was that?
Make sugars.
Yeah, it can make sugars through photosynthesis. So we'll actually send the sugars back down to the root system where the fungus is growing and feed the fungus. Okay? So it has to be a win-win relationship, and like I said, the fungus does get something out of it. They get sugars. Okay? That's what makes it mutual. Okay? And that's typically the case. And with these fungal partners, that's usually what they get in return. They can't make food for themselves, so the plant usually provides that for them. Now, the most important ecological role as a fungus are those roles that they play in forests, in this case as decomposers. Now, this refers to a group of fungi that we call saprophytes, or saprophytic fungi. Now, sapro means to absorb. To absorb, to sap, okay? Now, what do you think phyte refers to? We've mentioned this previously. I mean, it refers to plants, yeah. To absorb plants. And what this specifically refers to are those that basically break down and absorb the nutrients from dead plants, okay? Those that are basically being rotted, okay? So when a tree falls down in the woods, you have a log on the ground, or maybe you have a lot of leaf litter on the ground, these saprophytic fungi are the ones that are actually breaking it down, okay? They're recycling nutrients, okay? So the importance of this is that many of these nutrients would stay locked up in plants if it weren't for fungi. In fact, we've already seen what happens when plants actually die and there's nothing to break them down. Before we talk about the Carboniferous period, that was back during a time 350 million years ago when all these big lycopod trees were falling down these swamps, and there were no fungi yet that had evolved to break them down. And so basically they just piled up. And over time, all that carbon that was locked up in them basically became coal. Okay? Well, today that doesn't happen because we have fungi that rot them. that break them down, and they release the trapped carbon that are found in these plants. And so what we say are these fungi actually play a very vital role in recycling carbon. Okay? These saprophytes decompose plant remains and release materials that would otherwise be locked up in the plant. You may recall, I said plants take in CO2 and they store it as sugar. And in this case, that's the sugar known as glucose that you're looking at there. Very simple sugar. And many plants will turn around and turn some of that into cellulose, which is the main component of wood. Or they may store it. Anybody remember how plants store sugar? Starch. Yeah. So either they turn it into cellulose, which is one type of sugar, it's actually a structural sugar, or they will store it as starch. Okay? And when a plant dies, all that carbon that was taken from the air, this CO2, would be locked up as cellulose and starch inside the plant. There'd be nothing to break it down. Okay? That's where the fungi come in. Okay, the fungi will then feed on this cellulose and starch. In this case, breaking it down into its component parts. They decompose it, and they release that CO2 back into the air as they break it down. Okay? So it's actually part of a great big cycle. The plants actually take in the CO2, turn it into cellulose and other sugars. The fungi, as they rot them when they die, return it back to the air, okay, as CO2. Okay? Why do you think it's important that CO2 is returned back to the air? Do you have an idea?
It can be reused for photosynthesis?
Yeah, exactly. Because plants need it for photosynthesis. They have to be able to take it in and turn it into sugar. If it was never re-released, CO2 levels would just get lower and lower and lower, and basically photosynthesis will shut down. Plants wouldn't be able to photosynthesize, and we already talked about how important plants are. They're actually the pillars of most terrestrial ecosystems, and without them, ecosystems would basically collapse. So it's these organisms that keep that cycle turning, okay, these fungi. They break down and rot this plant material, re-releasing that carbon back into the air, okay? Now, this is actually a pretty unique thing because, and why fungi are so important, because they're the only organisms that can digest cellulose, okay? There are some bacteria that can do this, but fungi are specialists in it. They're one of the few groups that can digest cellulose. Not only that, they can digest the material that wood is made out of, called lignin, okay? Otherwise, these two materials are among the most indigestible materials on the planet. It's also one of the reasons why many organisms that have fungi in their guts can digest cellulose and lignin. They can't do it by themselves. They have fungi to thank for this, okay? So the fungi digest cellulose and lignins, okay? And I'll come back to this here in just a moment, how they're able to do this. So there's the two components that are the toughest material in plants. So here's an example of a carbon cycle. Plants taking in CO2, fixing it into sugars like cellulose and starch, and then as they die, the fungi actually break them down and release it back into the air. Okay? All right. So there are two primary growth forms in fungi. Okay, you can have single-celled forms, which are relatively uncomplicated, things like yeast, and I talked about the role of yeast previously. But if it's a single-celled fungus, we typically call it a yeast. Okay, there are many yeast species. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is just one of many. There's also those that actually cause yeast infections in humans. That's a different species called Candida albicans. So there are actually many species of single-celled yeasts. But the multicellular ones are the ones we typically focus on, and those have a very typical growth form. They usually consist of a big body of filaments, which we call the mycelium, and then some reproductive body that they produce as well, like mushrooms or puffballs or bracken fungus, or even the mildew and mold that you see growing on, rotten food, for example. Okay, but the main body of the fungus is that big mycelium. Okay? A big network of hyphae. So here's where fungi actually differ from plants and animals. Okay? So first of all, plants do have a root system, and the mycelium looks very similar to a root system, but it's the similarity in terms of how they look, okay, is kind of where it ends. Because with fungi, like I said, that what appears to be the root system for a fungus is actually the main body of the fungus. In plants, the root system is just an organ, just like everything else. But the mycelium is the main body of the fungus. Okay, what's growing underground or throughout their food, like for example, if you find a rotten log in the woods and you see fungus growing out of the top of that rotten log, well, the main body of the fungus is growing throughout that log. You just don't see it. Okay, if you were to break it up or maybe pull back the bark, you might see the mycelium. That's the main body that you're looking at right there. And that's what produces things like mushrooms. The mushrooms are just an organ. Okay, just a reproductive organ. Okay? So, if you were to knock down a mushroom in your yard, you haven't killed the fungus at all. All you've done is just knock down the reproductive structure. The main body is still growing underground. And so how they differ from other organisms is they actually grow throughout their environment using this mycelium. They're constantly changing shape because what they're doing is they're trying to look for new sources of food. So they grow throughout their environment, extending this mycelium in multiple directions. Okay? So, like I said, it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg when you see the mushrooms. There's the main body of the fungus right there on that, in this case, underneath the bark on that dead tree. Or, for example, if you see mildew or mold growing on the surface of food, like this bread here, like I said, the main body of the fungus is within the food. And I mentioned that, I still do to this day. My he's kind of conservative with food. And so if he has a piece of bread with a little bit of mold on it, he's like, oh, you can just scrape it off. It'll be just fine. You've probably seen people like that before. The thing is, though, is that by the time you see those reproductive structures, the body of the fungus is already growing throughout the food at that point. Okay, the mycelium is spread throughout it at that point. Okay, like I said, those reproductive structures, which is that discolored portion of the mold there, that's just the spore-producing structures. The main body is in the food, okay, growing throughout it. Okay, the mycelium that I told you about. In the case of molds, they're microscopic, so they're kind of hard to see. But they are there. So, they grow throughout their food. Now, the mycelium is just the main body. Each filament of the mycelium, okay, each little strand is what we call a hyphae. Okay? These hyphae, in this case, hyphae is plural for hypha. But the hyphae make up the strands that make up the mycelium. So that's each individual strand. And there are different types of hyphae. Okay? There are two varieties of them. And they basically have the same overall function depending on the type of fungus you're looking at. A key thing about fungi is that their cells can rapidly communicate very quickly. Okay? There's very little separation between them, if at all. And so with fungi, what happens is the cytoplasm and the nutrients and everything that flows throughout the fungus can flow very rapidly because there are no restrictions really between individual cells. They're all connected. And so they can transfer nutrients, cytoplasm, the fluid of the cell very, very quickly among the cells. So there are two types. Okay? One type of hyphae, so let's say that we're zooming into a little hyphae here, one of the little filaments, okay, is a situation where you can clearly see that there are cells, but the cells are only partially separated from each other. They have partial walls in between them, with little pores or little holes in between them. So each one of these is a partial wall, that you're looking at here. And here's the nuclei in each cell. And so because each one has a partial wall, basically it's a little hole in between each wall, okay, the nutrients can flow very quickly from one cell to the next. Okay. So when we have a hyphae that has partial walls, they call that a septate hyphae. Septate means basically partially walled. Okay. The other type of hyphae, okay, has no walls at all. Okay. Some of our hyphae, if you were to zoom into them, they do have walls, but there's no division between individual cells. Basically, all the cells are connected with no walls between them. If you were to look closely at the fungus under a microscope, you'd see all the nuclei just flowing together from all the different cells. And there's no real distinction as to where one cell begins and one ends. Okay? So with those fungi, there are no walls in between their cells. Okay? We call that the cenocytic hyphae. Okay? No walls between cells. Okay? That's what cenocytic means. Okay? So there are two types of growth forms in the hyphae of fungi. Okay? Either those that have partial walls, okay, like you can see here, the septate, or those that have no walls at all, okay, the cenocytic. So what does that mean about them? Well, it means that, like I said, materials can flow very quickly from one cell to the next. And this allows the fungi to grow extraordinarily rapidly. You might notice that some molds, for example, just appear to pop up on food overnight. Maybe you leave a piece of bread out on the counter. You come back the next morning, maybe there's mold growing on it, okay? Or many fruit seem to spoil very quickly. Or sometimes you'll even see a mushroom pop up in your yard overnight, okay? Well, that's because these fungi can grow extraordinarily quickly because there are no firm divisions between their cells. Either there are partial walls or no walls at all. So they can send materials very quickly from one cell to the next, allowing them to grow rapidly. And basically that's a way to respond to food. Whenever food becomes available, they can grow very quickly to take advantage of that. Like I said, they have to grow towards their food, so they have to be able to grow very rapidly, okay? So two types of hyphae, septate and cenocytic. Okay, both of them can grow, like I said, very quickly. Okay? So either partial walls or no walls at all. So here's a view of the body of a fungus. The mycelium growing underground. Okay? Or possibly throughout their food, whatever their food happens to be. Could be a downed log in the woods, could be a piece of bread, right? Or maybe something else that's rotting. But the point is, like I said, that's the main body, okay, that you're looking at there. And even this structure here, this fungus, this mushroom, right, is actually just a big twisted mass of hyphae, okay? These little filaments. In fact, I don't know if you have that actual lab where you get to look at fungus or whether it's going to be online this year or not. But we often get to look at fungi under the microscope. And a mushroom, if you were to cut a mushroom in half and look at it under the microscope, you'd actually see that what it is it's a densely packed structure made out of hyphae. You'll actually see all the little filaments that make it up. So even this is made up of those little filaments. It's part of that mycelium. Well, like I said, it's just part. If you were to cut this off, the fungus would be just fine. The main body is growing throughout their food. And so like I said, my dad thinking you can scrape off that mold and everything would be just fine, inaccurate, because all you've done is just remove the reproductive structure. The mycelium is still there, okay, growing throughout the food. So here's the septate hyphae with the partial walls, and you can see the little pore that connects the two neighboring cells to each other. So there's the cell wall there, okay. There's that pore, right. You also have those that have no walls at all. In this case, it's kind of hard to tell where one cell begins and one ends. And especially true if you look closely here. Here they've dyed the nuclei in the hyphae. And you really can't tell where individual cells are. You can see the nuclei, but they're all kind of interspersed amongst each other. And so that's called a cenocytic hyphae. Okay? Like I said, the idea is that they can grow very, very rapidly as a result of this. Okay? So a little distinction between cells in these fungi. Like I said, because mycelia are composed of branching networks of very thin hyphae, fungi have the highest surface area to volume ratio observed in any multicellular organism. Like I said, it's because they have to grow through their food. And so they have to be able to spread themselves thin to kind of search and kind of quest for new nutrients. The problem with this, though, is that when you have a very high surface area to volume ratio and you kind of spread yourself very thin, it means that you tend to dry out very quickly. And so fungi typically are restricted to very moist, warm environments. They have to be kept moist because they will dry out. And so the kind of conditions that spoil food, for example, if you were to leave food in kind of a warm, moist place, very rapidly it will be invaded by a fungus that starts to break it down. Okay? That's also the issue with athlete's foot. If people, if their toes basically are in a moist, wet environment for too long, very quickly, an athlete's foot fungus could actually start growing in that environment. So they tend to prefer these warm, moist environments, otherwise they dry out very quickly. However, their spores are a different story. The spores of many fungi are very resilient, okay, much like those of plants. And that's a way for the fungus kind of get its reproductive, get its offspring out there in the environment. The spores can last a long time until they find an ideal place to grow. Okay, so when you see mold kind of growing on the surface of bread, those are the spore-producing structures. And they're trying to get their spores out into the environment and maybe find a new warm place to grow, a warm, moist place to grow, maybe where there's more food. So the spores will land in variable locations, hoping that they'll land on a piece of food, maybe in a warm environment that's moist. However, if they don't, they won't germinate. The idea is that the spore has to land in this environment. It'll start producing a hyphae, then the hyphae grows into a new mycelium, and it starts the whole process all over again. So the spores are resistant, but the mycelium has to grow in a moist environment. That's the rule with these fungi. In addition to the hyphae, which make up the feeding mycelium, many fungi use hyphae to produce reproductive structures, like this mushroom that you see here. Okay, like I said, the mushrooms are just big bundles of hyphae, okay, extending into the structure here. Okay. So what it is, it's a big mass of hyphae. They're just highly compacted and condensed, and it's kind of watertight. Okay. And so those are what kind of pop up above ground, okay, or maybe out of a rotten log, okay, for example. So those are big multicellular reproductive structures that you're looking at there. Mushrooms, toadstools, puffballs are all made out of dense networks of these hyphae. Okay? So what you're looking at there, when I say it's a reproductive organ, okay, well, this is an organ that is associated with sex. Okay? So that's the result of sexual reproduction. Okay? Especially with mushrooms, one of our typical groups of fungi. Now, many fungi actually would reproduce asexually as well, and they typically do. And that's a very common practice in fungi, is to asexually reproduce, especially with molds, because molds are always on the lookout for new food, and so they have to respond rapidly when food becomes available. So the most common thing for a mold is to actually just clone yourself and just make clone spores, and I'll show you what this looks like here in just a moment. But if you can clone yourself, that's a great advantage because you don't have to look for a mate. You just start cloning your hyphae, and that's what a lot of them do. Okay, so it's a way to respond rapidly to food. However, many fungi can also practice sexual reproduction. Now, typically not the way you or I do. As animals or plants, as I mentioned before, they use sperm and eggs. Okay, fungi don't quite reproduce that way because they don't make sperm or eggs. Okay, there's only one group that does, and it's a very primitive group. The rest of them reproduce using their hyphae, okay, which are actually haploid, like sperm or eggs. And we're not going to have time to get to it today, but what you'll see is that with fungi, what they do is they actually just take two hyphae that are both haploid, like gametes, and they bring them together and fuse them, okay, in fertilization. So they do carry out sexual reproduction, but they don't use gametes. They don't use egg or sperm. Like I said, only one group does that, and it's a very primitive group, okay? Now, on that note, many of them have evolved various ways to sexually reproduce, and that's how we classify many of our fungi, is how they sexually reproduce, because every group has its own unique reproductive structure associated with it. So there are four groups here that I'll mention. Okay, the first are the chytrids, and chytrids are the primitive group I was telling you about. They're very common aquatic parasites of things like fish and insects and amphibians. These are the chytrids that you're looking at here, and they actually reproduce using swimming spores and gametes. So in this case, they actually do have sperm and eggs that swim, and they even have swimming spores. Like I said, they're aquatic. Okay? So they're the only group that does this. The rest of our fungi do not reproduce in this way. The rest of them actually have specific sexual structures that produce spores. Okay? So one of them, the zygomycota, more commonly known as the bread molds, actually produce a spore-producing structure called a zygosporangium, which is the fusion of two hyphae. They fuse almost like egg and sperm do. And they produce this puffball-like structures. To me, it looks a lot like it's kind of tapered on both ends like a football, okay? Especially under the microscope. But that's unique to the bread molds. It's a fusion of two hyphae that create a zygosporangium. Then, I'm sure many of you have actually seen mushrooms up close at some point, and you probably noticed that mushrooms have gills underneath them. okay? And that's where they actually produce spores. Well, if you look very closely at the gills of many of these fungi, which we collectively call the mycota, they have these little club-shaped structures under the microscope. And each club produces four spores. And every mushroom can have trillions of spores that are produced by these little basidium, by these clubs. Okay? So your typical mushroom, like a button mushroom or a portobello mushroom, has these structures, these little club-shaped structures under the microscope. So that's unique to that group. Okay? And then lastly, we have the mycota, which reproduce using structures called asci. And these asci are sacs, which hold 8 spores each. They always hold 8 spores. And what they do is they burst open from the tip and shoot spores upwards. Okay. Some common examples of things like cup fungi or truffles or morels are in this group as well. Some edible fungi belong to this group. And of course, as you'll see here later on in the chapter, the yeasts actually belong to the mycota as well. They also reproduce using this way, even though they're single-celled. So every group has its own characteristic reproductive structures. So I did say that fungi tend to reproduce asexually. I mean, that's the best method for many fungi because with sexual reproduction, you have to find a mate, okay, which is a time-intensive process. But if you don't have to find a mate, you can just clone yourself. And so many moles do this. If they know food is readily available, they can just put out spores that are clones very quickly. And when they do this, what they do is they take their hyphae, and here you can see the base of the hyphae here, and they branch it out into these structures which basically produce clones of the hyphae. Each clone is a haploid cell, okay? A spore. And they'll just put these spores out. The spores will settle on in a new location, hopefully on more food, and they'll germinate into a hyphae and grow into a new mycelium. And that way, molds can actually spread very, very quickly over food and spoil it also very rapidly as a result of this. Okay? So that's how many molds will reproduce. Now, many of these molds will sexually reproduce, but the only time they typically do that is when times are tough. So if they're running low on food, or maybe it's drying out in the environment, and there's not much time left to actually worry about getting more food, then that's when they'll actually turn to sexual reproduction. They'll start looking for a mate because if the environment is harsh, they want to make sure some of their offspring will survive. So that's when the genetic variability kind of kicks in. So they only kind of do that as a last resort. Okay? Really depends on the type of fungus, but this one that you're looking at here, that's penicillium. That green mold that you see growing on the surface of that orange, that's the species I told you about that actually inhibits the growth of bacteria. And that's what it looks like under the microscope. If you were to zoom into one of those, if you were to zoom into that green fuzz that you see there, each of those little hairs that make up the fuzz is actually a stalk eating in spores like this. Okay? And that's where that green color comes from. It's actually the spores that have that color that you're looking at there. All right. So I mentioned earlier, I said that plants, animals, and fungi, okay, they do share a common origin. And like I said, many fungi were actually considered to be plants at one time. Today we know that's not the case. Okay? Fungi and animals actually have far more in common with each other than fungi do with plants. And if you look at it, one of the biggest ones, okay, I'll go ahead and mention it here because I'll come back to it. So plants are autotrophs. Anybody remember what that means?
They make their own food?
Yeah, they make their own food. Okay, they turn sunlight and CO2 into sugar, basically. They can make their own food. Plants are able to make their own food. Now, what do we call organisms that can't make their own food and have to eat other organisms? A heterotroph, yeah. In fact, hetero means other. It means you're feeding on other organisms. And as we'll see, that's the biggest thing that fungi and animals have in common is their ability to feed. Both of them have to eat other organisms. Plants can make their own food. Okay? So that's one big similarity that fungi and animals have in common with each other is how they feed. Now, the method in which they eat other organisms is different, and I'll talk about that here shortly. But they have to eat other organisms. Okay? Now, some other characteristics they have in common. Okay, first of all, a key piece of evidence that they're closely related to animals is that many of the medicines that we use to treat fungi, okay, can actually be harmful to our own cells. Okay, this is because we share so much in common with fungal cells that many of the medicines that we could use to combat fungi can actually cause damage to our own cells and tissues. That's a line of evidence that shows how similar they are to us. Okay, we have to be careful in treating fungi. And so that means that fungal infections are often very difficult to deal with. They're hard to get rid of. Okay? On the other hand, getting rid of bacteria is pretty easy. Okay, bacterial infections, we just use antibiotics that target that peptidoglycan that is found in the bacterial cell walls, and we can wipe them out fairly quickly. But fungal infections are very difficult to deal with as a result of this, because of our close relationship. And even DNA evidence shows that we share more DNA in common with fungi than they do with plants. Okay? There's more of a DNA similarity there, indicating a common ancestor. Another line of evidence is in the structural material of the fungal cell wall. Okay? Fungal cell walls are made of chitin. What are plant cell walls made out of? Cellulose. Okay? Completely different structural material. And I mention it because we'll actually see chitin again later. Chitin is also found in animals called arthropods. Those that have an exoskeleton, like insects and crustaceans and arachnids. It's the same material. And that can't be just a coincidence. That implies a common origin between fungi and animals, that they have the same type of structural material, this chitin. Okay? In addition, if you look at those fungi that do have flagella, they have a single flagella, okay, much like a human sperm. Okay? In fact, if we go back to those chytrids, which are among the most primitive, you look at their spores and their gametes, a single tail, okay, much like a human sperm or an animal sperm. Okay? So remember I talked about them belonging to a group known as the Uniconta, the one-tailed, okay, eukaryotes. Okay? All of them, including the fungi, also, if they have flagella, will have a single flagella. Okay? So that's another common origin between the two. Okay? And they also store their sugar as a material called glycogen. Okay? So how did plants store their sugar? Starch. Okay? They store their sugar as starch. Okay? Now, on the other hand, animals actually store theirs in their liver in a material called glycogen. It's actually very structurally similar to starch, but it's actually branched. The fungi happen to store it in the same way, okay, as glycogen. Again, another line of evidence that they share a common origin with animals. Okay? They store their sugars as glycogens. Okay? So if you were to kind of break down the relationship between fungi and animals, you'd actually see that even though they do share an ancestor way back when, okay, back here in this tree, okay, so plants, fungi, and animals right here, that's their common ancestor, they share more in common with animals, and a very close relationship with animals, than they do with plants. It's a very distant relationship to plants. Okay? They have more in common with animals than they have with plants. So like I said, it's more proper to throw chapter 29 in with the animals because of their close relationship. They're not closely related to plants at all, okay, even though they look superficially very similar. All right. Like I said, approximately 90% of plants today live in physical contact with some type of fungi. In this case, what that means is when we say symbiosis, symbiosis is a relationship where both organisms are tied to each other. In this case, one cannot survive without the other, or in this case, one might die without its partner. That's what symbiosis means. Okay? You can kind of think of it this way. The fate of two organisms are linked. Okay? If one were to die, the other one would die. Okay? That's how important their relationships are. And some of them are mutual. I mentioned that, they both benefit from the partnership. Some are parasitic, and that's where one organism benefits, but the other one is harmed in the relationship. So a good example would be ringworms, okay, where the fungus is basically feeding on our skin cells, and there, of course, it's actually hurting us. It's itchy and very painful when you get a ringworm. So that's a sign that they're parasites. They're causing disease in that situation. Other relationships are commensal. And that's where one organism benefits, but the other one doesn't really notice that it's there, or in this case, it doesn't affect it. And you actually have other fungi living on your skin that don't really cause you any problems at all. They're basically breaking down, decaying, skin cells, those that we shed, and they're not really hurting us. Those are just a commensal fungus. Now, they can invade us when our immune system becomes weak, but until that point, they're just commensal fungi, okay? Little yeasts, more than likely. So I want to talk about some mutual relationships here. I've already talked about diseases and pathogens and parasites that fungi, in terms of their role there. So the biggest roles that they play, aside from the fact that they act as saprophytes and they break down wood, is as the mycorrhizal fungi, those that live in the root system of plants. And there's actually two varieties of these mycorrhizal fungi. There are those that live on the outside of roots, okay, or the root cells. We call those ectomycorrhizal fungi. And then we have those that live within the roots, the arbuscular mycorrhizae. And they're similar in many respects because their overall role is to enhance the surface area of the root system of the plant and help them take in more water and minerals. But the types of plants they tend to kind of, live with, in this case, partner with, are different. And they also have different geographic distributions where you would find them worldwide. But the big difference, so we have ectomycorrhizae. So ecto means outside, and these live outside the plant's root cells. They never actually invade the root cells. Here's an example of what they look like. This is an ectomycorrhizae, and what you're looking at is a cross-section of a plant's root system. And what you can see is that the fungus, this is all the hyphae that you're looking at here. This is the cross-section of the root. And so here's all the hyphae. And so here you can kind of see them extending on the outside. And these are all the plant cells inside that root system. And notice that the hyphae never actually penetrate them. They actually just kind of grow in between them, in between the walls. So they don't actually penetrate the walls of the plant's root system. And that's what we call them ecto, or outside mycorrhizae. Okay? And they're a very important type of ectomycorrhizae because these are the variety that grow in partnerships with forest trees. Okay, like oaks and pines, for example. That's a very important partner that they share. Otherwise, many of our forests would not be able to survive. Like I said, they're very commonly found in tree species in temperate latitudes. Temperate is basically the type of environment we're in now, where you get these cold winters and warm summers. Okay, so oaks, maples, but many conifers like pines, spruces, for example, depend on this little partnership. Okay. Now the other variety is called an endomycorrhizal fungi. Now endo, of course, is the opposite. Technically called arbuscular mycorrhizae, but like I said, technically known as endomycorrhizae. And of course, the endo means inside. Okay? So when you look at these, they actually grow inside plant root cells. Okay? The hyphae actually penetrate through the cell wall of the plant and into the cytoplasm. And they actually bring nutrients directly to the plant cells. Okay? Like it says, they form a little pipeline extending from inside the plant root to the soil well beyond the roots. They actually enhance their ability to take in water and minerals a bit further than the ectomycorrhizae actually do. So they're more advanced than the ectomycorrhizae. And here's an image of what that looks like. So here you can see the fungus and the hyphae extending from the plant root. And notice you can see the actual hyphae penetrating into the cells of the vascular tissue of the plant. Okay? That's what makes them endomycorrhizae. And here's an image of what that looks like. Here's the hyphae, and there's the mass, where they actually deliver nutrients into the plant cell. Here's a big plant cell in the image. That's one plant cell. Okay. But like I said, that's part of the vascular tissue of the root system that you're looking at there. And like I said, it's a very important relationship. I mean, even between both groups, because like I said, without them, these plants would wither and die without their little fungal partners. But this shows you, I think this one best shows you how intimate this relationship is. They are growing within the plant's root cells. So that tells you it's a situation where one cannot survive without the other. Okay, the fungi literally lives in the roots of that plant. Okay. And we talked about why they benefit. Okay, in that particular case, like I said, the fungi actually gets the sugar that the plant produces. And it can't survive without it. Okay. Now, one other one I want to talk about is the relationship known as lichen. Now, you may often see lichen growing on things of size, or growing on the sides of things like trees or rocks. Okay, these kind of flattened, leafy-looking, sometimes very colorful structures. In fact, many of our trees on campus, many of them that have actually died or might be dying, you'll actually see them covered in lichens. Now, lichens appear to be a fungus, or maybe just a single organism themselves. But what you're actually looking at is a partnership between a fungus and an algae. Okay? So this external structure here, which is kind of tough and leathery, is actually the fungus. But within that, it's very moist. Here you can see a cross-section of the lichen. And this is all the hyphae that are loosely packed inside the lichen, and it's very moist on the inside. And what this does, it provides a place for little algae to grow. In this case, green algae that you see here. In some cases, their partner also might be a little cyanobacteria, another type, of this case, a prokaryotic algae. But the point is, it's not one organism. It's actually a partnership between a fungus and an algae. That's what you're looking at here. Okay? So it's not one single organism. And in this case, well, I'll ask you a question here. So where do we typically find things like algae? Where do they normally grow?
In the water.
In the water, yeah. But where do we find lichens? Growing way up on the sides of trees or on rocks, far away from water. So what the lichen actually does, the fungal partner here, the hyphae, okay, actually creates a watertight barrier. The hyphae are densely packed on the outside, very tough and leathery, and that seals water on the inside. So that gives the algae a place to grow that is still very moist. It gets them far away from the water. So what do you think the fungus is getting out of this relationship? Letting that little algae grow inside them.
Get the sugar from algae?
Yeah, the sugars. Okay, that's usually the relationship that you find with the fungi. If they're growing with a little photosynthetic partner, that's usually what's happening, is that the algae or the plant is usually providing them sugar, and that's what's going on with lichens. They give the algae a place to live, and the algae in turn gives sugar back to the fungus. Okay? So that's why you can see them growing in places you don't typically see fungi or algae growing. Okay? They're watertight, and that's to give the algae a place to live. Okay? Now often, like I said, you may also see many fungi living in the guts of other organisms, especially those that digest wood or plant material. You know, I mentioned how tough cellulose and lignin are. They're the most indigestible materials on the planet, and fungi are among the only organisms that can break them down. And so when you see organisms that can digest wood or anything derived from wood, okay, in fact, you commonly see cockroaches eating paper, right, which is typically made out of plant material, or you may see cattle feeding on grass, which is rich in cellulose. It's hard to digest. Well, it's because they have little microscopic fungi, yeasts, or other single-celled fungi living in their gut, and they secrete these enzymes that help them break down that cellulose. If they didn't have these little fungal partners in them, they would not be able to digest the plant material. Okay? So it's because of the fungi that they're able to survive. That should give you an idea of just how important fungi are, because many organisms could not survive without them. Okay? Especially those organisms that eat wood and plants. So I mentioned that fungi are saprophytes, okay? Decomposing plant remains. Okay? Well, how are they able to do this? Well, first of all, like it says here, they grow throughout their food. Like I said, by the time you see mushrooms growing on the surface of a rotten log, they've already broken it down, and that mycelium has already spread well throughout that log. Okay? And so what they're doing is they're growing throughout their food, secreting enzymes and breaking it down from the inside out. And that's a key difference between them and animals. I mentioned that both of them are heterotrophs, okay? That fungi and animal are heterotrophs, okay? Well, the key difference between them is how they actually obtain nutrition, okay? They do eat other organisms, but how do they obtain it? Well, with animals have to ingest their food. Animals have a digestive tract, okay? We have a mouth, we ingest our food, we bring it into our body, and then we digest it internally, okay? All animals do this, okay? Fungi also eat other organisms, but because of the way they grow, they actually have to grow throughout their food. they can't ingest anything, so they just secrete enzymes on the outside, and then as the food breaks down, they absorb nutrients. We call that extracellular digestion, okay? So they do not ingest food, they actually break it down externally and then absorb nutrients. And so that's why they have to grow throughout their environment. They grow throughout that rotten log, for example, secreting enzymes as they go, and as the log breaks down, they absorb nutrients that are released from that rotten log. Okay, that's how they work, okay? So I mentioned that they're breaking down the two toughest materials on the planet, okay? In this case, cellulose is one of them, okay? But I'll also add here lignin, okay? The two most toughest materials that plants are composed of, cellulose and lignin. So how are these fungi able to break it down, okay? Well, usually when you find a rotten log in the woods, okay, it's a far cry different from what it was when the tree was alive. If you actually take your hands and kind of, act on that rotten log, it just basically falls apart in your hands. And what's actually going on there is the fungi have actually secreted some enzymes that break down that log. Okay, they've broken down the molecular structure of both the cellulose and the lignin at that point. Now, I guess this depends on whether you've taken 1107 or not, the Biology 1. But if you've taken Biology 1, you may have some background as to what enzymes are. But if you're not aware, enzymes are a type of protein. And these proteins, these enzymes, can do various things. But the two important jobs that enzymes do is either they build molecules, they help actually build molecules very quickly, or they can break molecules apart very quickly. That's what they do. They speed up reactions. And there are two very specific enzymes that act on the wood in plants, okay, that are secreted by fungi. One of them is called cellulase. Which breaks down, as its name implies, cellulose. In fact, enzymes are typically named on whatever they act on. But cellulase breaks down cellulose, and then we have one that breaks down lignin. It's called lignin peroxidase. And these are secreted by fungi, okay, as they grow throughout their food, okay, especially, like I said, this leaf litter or rotten logs or what have you. And what they're doing is, like I said, breaking down that molecular structure. Like I said, if you were to actually, kind of handle this wood, it's lost a lot of its integrity by this point as that fungus moves throughout it and kind of grows throughout it. It even takes on a different color. It has this reddish color, and that's because the lignin has oxidized and has been broken down, and so it's got this reddish color to it. So basically what they're doing is they're breaking down the molecular structure of the wood and making it easier to digest, and that's exactly what many of these do in the guts of organisms as well. Many insects actually have these little fungal partners that do the same thing. They break down the wood, make it easier to digest, and they break it down into little bite-sized pieces. Okay? But they're the only organisms that can secrete this lignin peroxidase and this cellulase, and that gives them an advantage in recycling, like I said, this plant material, okay, as these plants die. And like I said, they're releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. All right. So this is where I'm going to stop us on fungi right now.